Hi, I'm the Moonlit Page Turner, and here are all the books that I've read so far this year. This is my first quarter reads for 2024. Those are the books that I've read in January, February, and March of this year. Instead of putting them in chronological order or numerical order, I have categorized them by genre for you. So I have book club reads first, since I've already talked about them in previous videos or other podcasts. Then we're going to look at some of my nonfiction reads as well as fiction. For my book club picks, I'm actually in two book clubs. So the first one is the Savvy Gaming Network Video Game Book Club, and I will link that below. We read three books so far because we read a book each month that is based on or inspired by video games. So for January, we read Roadside Picnic, which was the book that inspired the game Stalker. For February, we read The Last Wish, which is the books that inspired the Witcher games. And then in March, we read Tom Clancy's The Division Recruited, which Tom Clancy has passed away. So other authors have picked up from him and used his IP. And this book was written by Thomas Parrott, and that's part of the Division series. The Roadside Picnic, I wasn't so impressed on. It was hard for me to kind of figure out what was going on since I've never played Stalker. The Last Wish was kind of surprising that I actually liked it because I'm not a huge fan of The Witcher. And then I really liked Tom Clancy's The Division Recruited by Thomas Parrott. It was action packed and it was fun to read. The next book club books that I'm going to talk about are from the Read the World series that I do here on YouTube, where I read books from authors from different countries. So for this first quarter read, I read books from the Bahamas. I read books from authors from Bahrain and from Bangladesh. So from the Bahamas, I read Face the Sun and An Evening in Guanama. So An Evening in Guanama, I have on my Kindle, and it was a series of folktale stories. And then Facing the Sun is young adult fiction. Actually, I really liked both of them. I've heard some of the folktales before reading Native American folktales, so some of them were familiar. A lot of them have to do with doing the right things, and the poor women who are pretty always get stolen or taken. And so those were entertaining. Facing the Sun is about four young girls that remind me a little bit of Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, because it's these four girls who are kind of transitioning from teenage to adulthood and the struggles that they have with their friendships and with their families. For Bahrain, I read Fortier, which is a self-published book about vampires. And then I also read The Pearl Thief, which was a short story that was inspired by the pearl diving that goes on in Bahrain. Both books I wasn't super impressed with. They were fairly short. I think I read both of each of them in a day. They just weren't for me. And then for Bangladesh, I read The Good Muslim, and I read, here it is, The Storm. So both of these books do take place in Bangladesh. For The Storm, we have a little bit in the United States as well, and this is actually a story in three different timelines. So Shar is kind of our main character. He lives in the United States. He is originally from Bangladesh, and he is about to lose his residency in the United States, and he has a daughter there, so he doesn't want to do that. So we see his struggle, and then we get his history from his birth parents that are in Bangladesh, where there is a storm. The storm is kind of the motif that goes throughout the story. And then we see a previous time too before Shar was born, and that is more of like historical fiction. So this one was really interesting, although it jumped too back and forth in the different time periods for me. So some of the stories got a little bit confusing. The Good Muslim is a second book in a series, but you can actually read this book on its own. It is about a brother and sister and their kind of struggles with life after Bangladesh independence. So the main characters are Maya and her brother Sohal. And Maya's a doctor, and she's kind of gone with this independence, and she's very independent herself. So Hall becomes very religious, and that greatly affects his life and the life of his son. At the beginning of the book, his wife dies, and that's what brings Maya back to Bangladesh. So I liked both of these books. I did like The Good Muslim better because this one was just jumping around too much in time periods for me. All right, let's talk nonfiction. I do like to read a diverse variety of books, and I do get a lot of my books from the library or from my Libby app that's connected to the library. So I'll put pictures up of what the books look like because I don't have the physical copies of these. The first one I want to talk about is What My Bones Know, and that's by Stephanie Fu, and it was fantastic. It was one of the best books that I've read in the last couple of years, but it is a very difficult book to read. So it is about Stephanie Fu and her life. She used to work for NPR. She's an investigative journalist, and she writes about her journey with complex PTSD. She kind of looks into how she got this PTSD diagnosis because she finds out she has it 10 years after talking to the same therapist. And a lot of it has to do with the abuse that she went through as a child, neglect as well. So there are quite a few trigger warnings, but she goes not only to her experience, but to other experiences that people with the same background of being a first generation or an immigrant, as well with the area that she grew up in. So it's very well researched and she is very raw. She actually, in the audio version, puts recordings with her and her therapist in there. But it is a great read if you are up to it, because if it's not something that you are there for mentally and emotionally, it is a difficult book to get to, but it was so good. Going from that to Brian Moylan's The Housewives. This is a book about Bravo. I was introduced to this book by listening to the Bravo Docket, which is a podcast it's by two lawyers who look at the legal side of Bravo and the Housewives. And so they mentioned it on their podcast. I really liked this book. Brian Moylan is a journalist. He writes a lot about Bravo. He was kind of one of the first people to do the recaps. He used to write for Vulture and Gawker. He's been in the New York Times. He tells a lot about the Housewives, but then he also goes into the history of Bravo, which I found to be really interesting. He also goes into the history of soap operas. That kind of set the stage for the Housewives. So this was a really entertaining book. He does a lot of research. You can tell he's a super fan, and he's been blacklisted, I think, from some events from the Housewives, but I really enjoyed it. So I think if you're a Housewives fan, it's definitely something you should check out. On the same kind of modality of podcasts, I also listen to Office BFFs, which is by Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey. They are two of the actors from the American version of The Office. They have a podcast, and that podcast has parlayed into this book. I listened to the audio version of this, which had some of their castmates come in, which was fun. This book to me was more about their friendship than their time on The Office. So I would have liked more stories about behind the scene things of The Office, but it wasn't bad. I think if you're an Office fan, you should check it out. Again, staying with podcasts, I released a video that I have a new series called Podcast Reads. And so I read my favorite murders, Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered by Karen Gilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. It was good. It's not about murder. So if that's what you're going in for, you're going to be disappointed. But if you're a fan of My Favorite Murder, you're going to like it. Some of the stories you may have already heard because they have talked about some of this. This is about their lives and kind of the things that they've gone through. They do talk about like eating disorders and drugs and how to deal with parents who have Alzheimer's. And so I liked it, but I think put that trigger warning on there because there are some sensitive topics. Stay Sexy, Don't Get Murdered actually led me to Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. So in Stay Sexy, Don't Get Murdered, Karen and Georgia kind of bond over this book that they're reading, and that is The Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. I haven't read any Brene Brown books before this one. I've seen some of her talks and have listened to a little bit of her podcast. I like some of the research that she does, but I was not super impressed with this book. There is a difficulty when it comes to doing the type of research that she does. If you don't know who Brene Brown is, she is probably most well known for her research in shame. She started off looking at solely women, and then a bunch of men complained at her talks. And so she started to look at men as well, and she kind of learned a lot from that. A lot of her data is qualitative, which means she interviews people and kind of pulls in the responses that they have. The book title, Daring Greatly, is from a Teddy Roosevelt quote that is a little misconstruing of what this book is actually about. This book is about being vulnerable and it is about shame and her research and kind of how it delves into like parenting and the relationships that we have with other people. I would have liked for Brown to be a little bit more transparent in the type of research that she does. We don't get anything about who she's talking to, um, how many people she's talking to from different cultural backgrounds or from different socioeconomics. We don't see any of that, and she doesn't explain that in the research. So for someone who has more of a scientific background, like that stuff is more interesting to me. And I always kind of look at what the study is actually doing when looking at that type of stuff. So I wasn't greatly impressed. There was some really good stuff in there. I would say if you're not someone who like looks at statistics and studies, you're gonna like it. But it was just missing quite a bit for me. The last of the nonfiction books, I started with a great one, I'm gonna end with a great one, which is The Family Romanov, and that is by Candace Fleming. The Family Romanov looks at the last Tsar of Russia, which was Nicholas. And during World War One, Nicholas will abdicate the throne, so he kind of gives up the monarchy in Russia. He has a well-known family. Rasputin is in there. We see kind of the fall of the Romanovs, is what it is. Kind of all the things that led to him being turned against his own country. He was known as the Bloody Tsar, Nicholas the Bloody, because of firing upon protesters and many other things that he did. That wasn't great. But people probably most know either Rasputin or Anastasia. We do see what happens to the family at the end. They are killed. They do end up finding the Romanov bodies in the 70s, but it's still communistic. So they wait until the 90s to kind of be like, look, we found them. And they do get reburied, but two of them are missing. And it is one of the younger daughters. So it's either Anastasia or Maria, and then Alexei, who is the young son who has hemophilia. And those two bodies are missing. And this is kind of what has led to this big, like, "Ooh, Anastasia's still alive. Ooh, Alexi's still alive. Maybe Maria's still alive." So it's like 100 people have come forth saying that they're one of these three people. They do eventually find the other two bodies in the early 2000s, so 2007, where we know for sure that through DNA testing, all of the Romanovs were murdered. I really liked this book. It flowed really well, and Fleming does something else where she's not only talking about the Romanovs, but she's talking about ordinary citizens and people of the lower class. So we see some of their testimonials and some of their diary entries. So you can see how grandiose this family was and how not well off most of the people in Russia were at that time. And this is where you get this huge disconnect. We saw it with the French Revolution. We'll see it again and again. Anytime you have a big gap between the wealthy and the poor, revolutions happen. So I really liked this book. This led me to want to hear more, and this will lead me to my first fiction pick. For fiction, I do read a lot of historical fiction. I do like nonfiction. So the Family Romanov led me to want to learn about Anna Anderson, who was probably the most well known Anastasia. She kind of came out early and she claimed to be Anastasia for her whole life. And she ended up dying, I think, at the age of 80 with cancer. So in the book, I Was Anastasia by Ariel Lahan, she tells the story of Anastasia, and that story is told in chronological order from their captivity up until their death. And then she tells the story of Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Anastasia, and she was kind of probably the best known Anastasia. The thing I didn't like about this book, though, is as we get the story of Anastasia, we are also getting the story of Anna Anderson. The story of Anna Anderson is told backwards, which she did on purpose. It was a huge feat. It would have been cool if it wasn't intermingled. So I'm getting the story of Anastasia going one direction, the story of Anna going in another direction, and it's like every other chapter we get a little bit of it. So I lost some of the important details of Anna Anderson. The end is really graphic, by the way. So if you are someone who is a little bit more sensitive, it talks about the deaths of the Romanov families. It does talk about their sexual assaults as well, and it talks about what happened to Anna Anderson, which is not her real name, but at the beginning of her life that made her kind of take on this persona of Anastasia. And so if I would have heard one story and then the other story would have continued, or if I would have heard Anna's story backwards and then heard Anastasia's story, I think that would have been better. I was just missing some of the details as we go backward in time because we'll read a chapter where she'll be talking to someone, and then the next chapter she meets that person for the first time. And so it was just too much for me. Two stories going in different directions was just too much for me. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Shadowlands by Elizabeth Kostova. Elizabeth Kostova is probably best known for The Historian, which was a retelling of Dracula. This book is another one that was just too much for me. So, in the Shadowlands, we are in Bulgaria, and we actually get three stories in here. So, I felt like this was like three books in one. It was just too much story. The main character, her name is Alexandria, and we see the story of her in the United States with her family. Her brother goes missing during a camping trip, and he is never found. And this greatly affects Alexandra's life, so much so that she decides to move to Bulgaria to teach English. Once she arrives in Bulgaria, she is tired. She just got off the plane. She kind of meets this family. She's helping in a taxi, and then she ends up with this box. And she looks in the box, and it's ashes. It's human remains. So she's in her taxi with her taxi driver Bobby, who was my favorite in this book. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, what do we do?" So there's this whole adventure of Alexandra and Bobby trying to return these ashes to this family that she doesn't know who they are. And then we see the story, the third story, which was my favorite out of all three, was the story of who is this person in the box. And we find out that his story, he is a kind of famous violinist. His name is Stoyan Lazarov, and he has a great story. And this is really a political drama with what happened in Bulgaria as well. So I like the way that Kostova writes. She's very detailed. Again, this was just too much story for me. Probably would have gotten rid of Alexandra's family story at the beginning and just told her coming to Bulgaria. You could have probably had a chapter of her with her brother, but there's just too much information for me. One of the things that I'm trying to do this year, as I'm sure everyone else is trying to do, is to tackle my TBR list. So I decided to tackle it from both ends. I do have a TBR list on Goodreads. I started that in 2011, and come to find out, I am a very different person from the time. So the next couple of books are books that I was interested in over a decade ago. The first one I'm going to talk about is For the Wolf. It is by Hannah Witten. I like fairy tale retellings. This one to me just fell a little flat. It is supposed to be about Little Red Riding Hood. However, it's more like Beauty and the Beast. So in this lore, the first daughter is for the throne, the second is for the wolf. There is this magical forest that keeps the monsters at bay, and so the second daughter has to be sacrificed to the wolves, to the wolf that protects the forest. And that is Red. And Red at 16, she kind of they go to the forest beforehand, and she bleeds on a tree, so she has the mark, so she gets sacrificed. Her older sister tries everything she can in order to save Red. Red meets the wolf, and she kind of likes him, and they have a bond. And then we get some of the lore. The lore is kind of given to you throughout the novel. I feel like it would have been more successful if I would have heard the lore first. And then as they're referencing it, it would make more sense of how lore kind of goes from fact to fiction. So it fell just a little bit flat for me. There is a sequel to it. I probably will not read that one. One of the other books that piqued my interest in like 2011 was Water for Elephants. I saw the movie. I was not super impressed and I should have stopped there. There are some things that I liked about the book. This is by Sarah Gruen. It is a historical fiction. It does take place during the Great Depression, and we see kind of circus life and how awful that is. We have Jake Jankowski, who is a veterinarian student, and his parents die, leaving him kind of destitute and an orphan. And so he runs away to the circus, and he meets a woman who he falls in love with, but she's married to someone else. There is kind of a notebook aspect to here where you get the story told by Janowski, who is now in his 90s. He doesn't quite know how old he is. A circus is coming to town, and so that's allowing him to reminisce about his time in the circus. The saddest part in this book was when older Jacob's family forgets about him and they don't come to take him to the circus. And that was heartbreaking for me. Anyone who's ever had to deal with older parents or grandparents, there is not a lot that they can do in life, and they look forward to your visits every single time. And that was heartbreaking to me. All in all, I was not super impressed with this book. I kind of wish I had not read it. The next one I was also really excited about. It is Octavia Butler's Parables of the Sower. It is a book that is highly recommended. Read Kindred by Butler, and I really liked that book. This is a dystopian world where everyone kind of either lives out in it's like the Wild Wild West, where they're shooting people and stealing their stuff, lighting people on fire, or you live in these kind of gated communities. And our main character, Lauren, lives in a gated community with her family. Things go wrong. She has to leave, and she kind of picks up people as she goes, and they become their own community. So there was a lot of really good things in this book. It changed dramatically. The thing that I didn't understand, which is the central part of this book, is it's called Earthseed. That's what this whole series is. Earthseed is the religion that Lauren creates, and it's how she gets people to kind of come together and follow her. I don't fully understand what Earthseed is, and I don't know if I'm supposed to. I think everyone kind of pulls whatever they think it's supposed to be, and she's like, "Yeah, yeah, that's it." That's kind of what happens throughout the whole book. So I thought it was an interesting concept. I was just not totally sold. Also in 2011, I there was my steampunk phase, I'll admit to it. I wanted to read The Sherlockian by Graham Moore, and I'm so glad that I did. The Sherlockian is again, we have two storylines that end up emerging. So The Sherlockian is about Sir Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock. He has a missing diary, and the Sherlockian kind of fan club, they are in desperate search for it, and somebody finds it. The person that found it ends up dead. And so one of the members, his name is Harold White, he takes on kind of the mantle of Sherlock, and he is going to solve this crime about who killed Alex. So we see a little bit of what's happening with Sir Conan Doyle. He, at this time, which is what the diary is about, is solving a murder with the help of his BFF, Bram Stoker. And then we see Harold White in the present time. He is trying to solve the murder of Alex, and in order to do that, he has to find the diary. I think the chapters in those two stories went well together. Also, what I was super impressed with, Graham Moore, is the fact that a lot of it is based on fact. The murder that Sir Conan Doyle is trying to solve, not real, but he did help Scotland Yard sometimes, which is impressive. And the murder of Alex, who had the diary, is based on a true story. So that was crazy. I liked it. It was well paced. I liked the characters. I love Dracula, so the fact that Bram Stoker showed up, I was there for that. For my next read, there are a couple series that I'm trying to go through. I had to put a pause on Sue Grafton's Alphabet Murders. That was a little triggering for me, and I'm sure I'll pick it up and finish it. But one of the series of books that I'm reading is the Expanse series. And so I finished book number 4, which is the 4th season of the show as well. And that's Cibola Burning. And so James S.A. Corey is the author, but it's actually two friends that write the book series together. And in Cibola Burning, we have the Rocinante crew, James Holden. They are sent to a planet which is on the other side of the gate. And there's a dispute on who owns the planet, who's able to settle there. The more and more I read sci fi, the more and more I learn about politics. So almost every sci fi book that I read has like a really strong sense of politics in it. Dune, I read that several years ago. That is definitely all about politics. So, and that's more fantasy than sci-fi, but I love the Expanse series. If you liked the show, I would highly recommend the book. They are very similar. There's actually more books than there is seasons, which was sad because it was a great show. And they do a good job of combining it. So if you were a fan of the book series, I would suggest watching the show if you have not. And if you watch the show, I would suggest reading the books. Another book that I was kind of excited about, but a little worried about is Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Stephen King is very hit and miss for me. So, The Green Mile, I loved. It's very sad. Several other books I don't like from Stephen King. So I was interested to see his take on fairy tales. So the cover is really enticing. This book is really long, as a lot of Stephen King's books are, which is weird considering that he started his writing as a short story writer and then he makes these, 1,000-page books. Um this one again, as some of the other fictions, I felt like there was a lot of information that I didn't need. So a third of the book is about developing the characters, in particular the character of Charlie. I did not need to know all this fun information on Charlie. So because I read the audio, it was 6 hours in before we got to the final fairy tale part of this book, and then there's all this other part after it, because Charlie will go to a different, like, world, and he'll have to, well, he gets captured, and so he kinda has to rescue this fairy tale world, and he becomes the prince that was promised, which it was an interesting story. I just really didn't need the first 6 hours of this book, so I felt like you could have done a couple chapters and that would have set up the fairy tale portion of it. So again, Stephen King, just hit and miss for me. This one was kind of like in the middle where I liked portions of it, but a lot of it I didn't need. The last book that I'm going to talk about is actually the first book that I read this year, and that is Sold by Patricia McCormick. Sold is young adult. It is historical fiction. It is based on a lot of facts, though. And Sold is probably the most banned book in American schools today. Patricia McCormick is a journalist. And so instead of taking one person and telling her story, she turned it into fiction. And we see Lakshmi, who is like the sweetest person. Lakshmi is from Nepal, and she ends up being sold into sexual slavery by her stepfather, because he needs money for whatever he uses it for. Part of the story is we don't find out what happens to him or her mother and her half brother, but it's honestly what she goes through. She's such a sweet girl, and it's so horrific. So this again is trigger warning, but that poor girl, she does everything she can for her family, and she just gets disappointed, disappointed, disappointed. And the things that happen to her are obviously horrible. And then at the end of the book, the author does go into author's note with fact versus fiction. And this is a young adult fiction. Lakshmi is not based on one sole person, but kind of a combination of a bunch of women and girls. Um, your heart just breaks for Lakshmi like the whole time. But then you find out, and this is in the author notes, because she is again, McCormick is a journalist, that 12,000 women and girls from Nepal alone each year are sold into slavery. That's horrific. And like, I'm glad she told us that at the end, as well, and I'm glad I know that piece of information, because the more you know, the more that you can do about it. And books like these, Sold, Speak by Laurie Anderson, The Hate You Give, these are all banned books. Alice in Wonderland is a friggin' banned book. But these books give voices, and in particular to Speak, Laurie Anderson, to people who have lost their voice or have never had a voice. And so these books are so important. And it is important for people to choose to read these books and to be able to read these books. So I am not a proponent of banned books. I read banned books all the time. And if you're like, we're going to ban this book, that's now on my reading list. So I'm really glad I read Sold. It was really difficult. If you are not in the headspace, do not pick it up. That is your choice. But this is the warning that you get beforehand. Make sure that you are in kind of a space to deal, because it is very difficult to read. It is a very important story. She does not go into a lot of graphic detail, which I really appreciated, but Lakshmi, she is someone I think that will stay with me forever. Thank you so much for stopping by and listening. Hopefully, you made it all the way to the end. If not, you could have just skipped to whatever you found more interesting. I do have the timestamps on there for you for that. Yeah, and I will see you again in the next 3 months to give you more, hopefully, great reads. See you then.